You made it all the way to the last chapter of Leviticus. If you've studied with us, you've done Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Acts. Very, very proud of you. I hope you're proud of yourself. You've accomplished something 99% of Christians have never done. So you're making great progress. I was asked the other day, it's like, well, what is the point of this? Well, the main point is to get the Word of God out. The other side of it is I want my children and grandchildren to have a record of me teaching the Bible and a record of what God wants from them, and hopefully they follow in those ways. That's the point. I'm not becoming famous off of it. I'm not becoming rich off of it or anything like that. I just feel like God wanted me to do it, so I'm doing it, being obedient. And again, let me beat this dead horse. This is not about salvation. This is not about guilt or fear or any of that stuff. It's about learning what God wants from this relationship and trying to live up to that. Just trying to follow what it is He wants us to do, and maybe not follow some things that are just extra church doctrine, halakha, as we learned, which is Jewish doctrine, stuff like that. Not all doctrine's bad. I'm not against all doctrine. I'm not against church. I'm against us not knowing what the Bible actually says versus what somebody else said it said. Read it for yourself. Check me. Check everybody. But if you read it and study it yourself, it's much easier for you to notice when somebody tells you something that's not real truth. So we're in Leviticus chapter 27. I'll read from the New Living Translation. Not a whole lot of difference here, but we'll jump right in. The Lord said to Moses, give the following instructions to the people of Israel. If anyone makes a special vow to dedicate someone to the Lord by paying the value of that person, here's the scale of value to be used. A man between the ages of 20 and 60 is valued at 50 shekels of silver, as measured by the sanctuary shekel. A woman of that age is valued at 30 shekels of silver. A boy between the ages of 5 and 20 is valued at 20 shekels of silver. A girl of that age is valued at 10 shekels of silver. A boy between the ages of 1 month and 5 years is valued at 5 shekels of silver. A girl of that age is valued at 3 shekels of silver. A man older than 60 is valued at 15 shekels of silver. A woman of that age is valued at 10 shekels of silver. If you desire to make such a vow but cannot afford to pay the required amount, take the person to the priest. He will determine the amount for you to pay based on what you can afford. And this is not the value of people, it's the vow price for these things. Much, much different. So don't go running off and say women are worth less. But in this culture, he wouldn't have valued them the same because they wouldn't have accepted it. That's just not how they saw things. So he's using where they are. So if your vow involves giving an animal that is acceptable as an offering to the Lord, any gift to the Lord will be considered holy. You may not exchange or substitute it for another animal, neither a good animal or for a bad, nor a bad animal for a good one. But if you do exchange one animal for another, then both the original animal and its substitute will be considered holy. If your vow involves an unclean animal, one that is not acceptable as an offering to the Lord, then you must bring the animal to the priest. He will assess its value, and his assessment will be final, whether high or low. If you want to buy back the animal, you must pay the value set by the priest, plus 20%. If someone dedicates a house to the Lord, the priest will come to assess its value. The priest's assessment will be final, whether high or low. If the person who dedicated the house wants to buy it back, he must pay the price set by the priest plus 20%. Then the house will again be his. If someone dedicates to the Lord a piece of his family property, its value will be assessed according to the amount of seed required to plant it. 50 shekels of silver for a field planted with 5 bushels of barley seed. If the field is dedicated to the Lord in the year of Jubilee, then the entire assessment will apply. But if the field is dedicated after the year of Jubilee, the priest will assess the land's value in proportion to the number of years left until the next year of Jubilee. Its assessed value is reduced each year. If the person who dedicated the field wants to buy it back, he must pay the price set by the priest plus 20%. Then the field will again be legally his. But if he does not want to buy it back and it is sold to someone else, the field can no longer be bought back. When the field is released in the year of Jubilee, it will be holy, a field specially set apart for the Lord. It will become the property of the priest. If someone dedicates to the Lord a field he has purchased, but which is not part of his family property, the priest will assess its value based on the number of years left until the year of Jubilee. On that day, he must give the assessed value of the land as a sacred donation to the Lord. In the year of Jubilee, a field must be returned to the person from whom he purchased it, the one who inherited it as a family property. You may not dedicate a firstborn animal to the Lord, for the firstborn of your cattle, sheep, and goats already belong to him. However, you may buy back the firstborn of a ceremonially unclean animal by paying the priest assessment of its worth, plus 20%. If you do not buy it back, the priest will sell it at its assessed value. However, anything specially set apart for the Lord, whether a person, an animal, or family property, must never be sold or bought back. Anything devoted in this way has been set apart as holy, and it belongs to the Lord. No person specially set apart for destruction may be bought back. Such a person must be put to death. 1/10 of the produce of the land, whether grain from the fields or fruit from the trees, belongs to the Lord and must be set apart to him as holy. If you want to buy back the Lord's 10th of the grain or fruit, you must pay its value plus 20%. Count off every 10th animal from your herd and flocks and set them apart for the Lord as holy. You may not pick and choose between good and bad animals. You may not substitute one for another. But if you do exchange one animal for another, then both the original animal and its substitute will be considered holy and cannot be bought back. These are the commands that the Lord gave Moses on Mount Sinai for the Israelites. So that all makes perfect sense, right? Like, you probably don't even want an explanation of that one. It was so clear. This chapter is about sanctuary funding. And remember, they're still at the foot of Mount Sinai. So they don't have homes, crops, and all that stuff right now. These are things that are coming. So they're learning right now. So the goal was for the priesthood to get silver to purchase whatever they needed. The idea was that a vow could be made to give something, then the giver would turn around and redeem or buy back whatever he had given. And that price plus 20% would help fund the sanctuary. And it's really important to understand this redeeming concept, this principle, because this is what we're going to see in the New Testament. So the rules were constructed, so most of what the sanctuary received was silver. They didn't really want you to bring all the animals and the crops there, because then they would have to just turn around and sell it. So what they would do is assess the value, add 20%, and then you'd give it to them in silver. That was the plan. So the rules are just created that way, make it easier on the sanctuary. Churches lump all their giving together and they call it tithes. But Leviticus breaks it down into categories, which tithing is just one of those categories. So if you've ever heard someone say it's time for your tithe and offering, it's because the tithe is just one of those. The other offerings are still expected. So no command is given in the New Testament to tithe. Tithing and giving was assumed in the New Testament because they knew the Old Testament. They knew the Torah, and the Torah had not been abolished. And Yeshua said that every stroke remained intact until heaven and earth disappeared. So the subject of giving is usually quotes like Luke 11:42 that says, "But woe to you, Pharisees, for you pay tithe of mint and rue and every kind of garden herb, and yet disregard justice and the love of God. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others." And look at this verse that is usually ignored. This is Matthew 23:23. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others." So we have Yeshua stating that not only is tithing a provision of the law, but also justice and mercy and faithfulness are the weightier provisions of the law. They mean more without neglecting the others. So we see that this is not a popular verse because You're supposed to do it all, not neglect some of the other ones by just giving. And I've been in churches where people wrote really big checks so they didn't have to act right, so they didn't have to treat people right. They got away with it because they wrote really big checks. And God says right here that that's not useful. Don't do that. So it's assumed that the reader has a background in these matters. So the Torah was 1300 years old by the time Yeshua arrived. So it was the basis for the lifestyle of the Jewish people. It was, everybody knew it, everybody studied it, everybody lived by it. Jesus doesn't explain tithing because it was common knowledge. Every Jew knew what tithing meant. It is the principles of the law that we need to be aware of more than the details. What are the weightier provisions of it? What did it mean? So the Hebrews made vows to God all the time, especially when they were worried or scared. It's one of those, the vows were public too. It's like, God, if you'll do this, I'll do that. So they were made known to the priest and accompanied with ritual so everybody knew about it. However, you could buy back your vow for a price. So in verse 1, this is the case where a person offers himself. I'm dedicating myself to the sanctuary in service to the temple. In most cases, this person was not going to be able to carry out the vow because he was not from the Levite tribe. So in verses 3 through 8, explain how the priest was to arrive at a proper amount for that person. So it's not about someone's value, it's about what the priest and the sanctuary could benefit from that kind of thing. And since like I couldn't fulfill that vow, I would have to buy it back. I would have to redeem that vow. So this may not sound like a lot, but the wages for 1 month was about 1 shekel. So it cost a mature male about 4 years of wages to redeem himself. So that's a lot of money. When it came to a woman's relationship with God, she could have one on a personal basis. And that was a really big deal because that was not prevalent in any other religion. It was all about the male. And God put a price on the female. She could have this kind of relationship too. So a 20% surcharge was added for a person to redeem an animal. The idea behind verse 9, where it says that any animal brought as an offering to the Lord may not be redeemed, the principle of holy property is what we see there. And we've studied this before. Once it's offered to the Lord, it becomes his property, so you can't take it back. And that's why I said, whenever you say, hey, if I win the lottery, I'm going to do this. Well, once you do that, that money is God's, and you can't steal it and keep it. You need to give it away. So in other words, at that point of decision, the animal becomes God's holy property. And if a person tries to make a substitute, then the priest keeps both, because once you pick something else, now that's holy property. So verse 11 talks about an animal exchange for money since it can't be used for sacrifice. And that's just, again, another way to kind of get money for the operation, but also fulfill vows to God and give in a sense. So verse 14 shifts to inanimate objects, things. These things are set apart for God. If someone consecrates his house but wants to get it back, it cost him 120% of the market value. So in verse 25, what it means is the content of the shekel is to be silver and the weight 20 gerahs. Gerahs. Anybody could mint their own coins back then. So he set the standard that it had to be this, a silver shekel from the temple, or from the sanctuary. Many years later, the priest minted temple coins. And by Yeshua's day, the only way someone could pay this was using the temple coins. Watch this. I don't know if you even knew this or not, but the money changers that Yeshua kicked out and overturned all the tables and stuff, they bought those foreign coins from Jewish pilgrims for a low price and exchanged them for temple coins at a higher price. That's why he was so upset. They were taking advantage of the rules that God put in place by being the middleman between these two values of shekels. So the next type of offering is called a firstlings. Unclean animals can be consecrated to the Lord. that person must redeem it, or a priest sells the animal, and then it's 20% above the market value. So your first would be dedicated to the Lord, but because it wasn't a clean animal, it had to be redeemed for a price. So it might be that the person has no money and the animal is held for a time until that person can come up with the money to redeem it too. So verse 28 describes a type of setting apart for God that can be where there can be no redemption. It's a permanent consecration. So what's important to see is that there are a number of kind of classes of giving things to God or setting things apart for God, each with its own rules and regulations and purposes. The idea that we give 10% of our income and we're off the hook, we've satisfied that, is that we see someone in need and we can look the other way, we've already given. That's not found in the Bible in any way. That's just something we came up with. So the tithe represents one kind of giving, not all giving. And verse 29 means no one given the death penalty can be redeemed. He must die. So you can't just pay to get out of that. There is a connection between a person violating a very serious law of God and the setting aside of things for God. We're going to see how God views justice. So a person who is to be killed for violating God's law is in God's eyes being set apart for him, in the sense that God is taking back the life that he has given them. So that's why you can't redeem them and take them back. So a tithe is an automatic giving of 10th of your increase, in addition to all the other types of giving and devotions to God. He is not obligated to pick out the best portion or permitted to pick out the worst. The tithe is just an honest representation of what someone has. So this is different from a first fruit offering or a ritual sacrifice where only the best is given to God. These are different things. So our response is taken seriously. Changing your mind is costly. Yeshua takes the meaning of all of this to another level. He says it's better to let your yes be yes and your no be no. Yeshua is pointing out that there's a downside to making vows to God, particularly if you're not very good at following through on them. He says don't do them at all because they're very costly, and we shouldn't just make them off the cuff and think that we're okay with that. So that is the book of Leviticus. I think you will agree, and send me a message, something that says you think this is the greatest book in the Bible. Even if you don't really think that, say it, because then that'll make me feel better about it. And I joke around a lot, but mainly the goal of Leviticus is to learn what holiness means. Wholeness. God's holiness must be protected. And in order to come into closeness with that, we need Yeshua, the Messiah, Jesus the Christ. That's still the only way to salvation. And that's the only thing that you need to get to what we just talked about in Leviticus. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please let me know. Otherwise, love God, love people, and change the world. We're going to do Numbers next. It's going to be fun.